Well, it was so hard to put your hand on a fact. And that's like things we should remember about the wilderness years.
Yeah.
You did not know how much these were averaged. And the moment Miss MacLeod broke down at the commission was the moment she saw internal emails where the department had used data engineers to get a figure for how prevalent averaging was.
Yeah.
And it was in 76% of the cases. And I can say that had that fact been in the public record in January 2017, it would have changed an awful lot.
Welcome to the Westminster Tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Caroline Crozabarlo. I am a public servant here in the South Australian Government, and in this bonus episode, I sit down with Dr. Darren O'Donovon from La Trobe University's Law School and a long-time keen observer of Robodebt. Dr. O'Donovon does a couple of really important things in this interview. Firstly, and I think he would say most importantly, he brings a ferocious focus on the experience of the victims and lingers in that deep discomfort of treating Robodebt as a teachable moment. Secondly, he gives us some really useful theoretical framings for understanding the forces that shaped how Robodebt unfolded, from thinking about administrative burden to the structure of stereotypes to the ideas of moral distance in bureaucracy. Thirdly, he talks through the way in which the Commissioner's findings are both generous to public servants and restrained in their scope. They don't, in general, create new rights for social security recipients, but instead challenge the public sector to do better, to operate in the way it's supposed to. This interview was recorded before the release of the government's response to the Robodebt Royal Commission on Monday the 13th of November, which means we don't get to discuss the government's decision to reject the Commissioner's 57th recommendation, which relates to removing cabinet confidentiality as an absolute exemption to FOI. It's a pity, but if you listen to the end of the interview, you'll hear Dr. O'Donovon's thoughts about why that particular recommendation was so important and so powerful in his view. I found this interview incredibly interesting to undertake. Dr. O'Donovon is a long-time observer and gives a real sense of what it was like to be outside of Robodebt and trying to look in and make a difference. I really encourage you to have a listen. I am very pleased today to be hosting a special episode featuring Dr. Darren O'Donovon, who responded to what he called a nerd bat signal in one of our previous episodes, which made me laugh louder than I should have, and is here to give us his perspectives about what he thinks public servants should be learning from Robodebt. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. O'Donovon. Can I just call you Darren?
Absolutely. I mean, it was the idea I wasn't listening that struck me, you know. We're talking about, the podcast is called Westminster Tradition and involves a deep dork out on public service. It's kind of self-selecting.
Yeah. The Venn diagram was strong.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, so before we get into it, like, how do you, an Irish lawyer, end up dedicating so much of your time digging through the entrails of an Australian public service scandal? How did you get here?
Does a love story fit the Westminster Tradition? That's the question, because that's pretty much how I ended up in these climes. So I managed to meet an Australian lawyer way back in the mists of time. We met at Human Rights Law Summer School.
Nerd camp there. Yep.
Yep. And I owe it all to the Australian Public Service, because we actually would have spent as few as 30 or 40 days in each other's presence before I applied for the sort of Paddington Bear fiance visa that I applied for. So how did I end up talking about the Australian Public Service? It's the Australian Public Servant who looked at our I mean, I'm an academic, so I look really good on paper.
Yes.
So yes, there were love letters and these things, and there was a lot of Skype.
Of course.
And we handed all that over to a bureaucratic decision maker, and that decision maker had to decide: is this probative evidence of a commitment to a shared life together? And the public servant said yes.
See, and now I'm wondering if we fed in all of that to ChatGPT, would it come to the same determination that you were in a legitimate relationship?
Well, it's funny because one of the things I want to talk about that I would want your listeners to kind of take away would be this idea of a free text life. Because that's what I was in that moment. I was obviously in a very unusual long-distance relationship. And I was looking for the bit of discretion, wasn't I?
Yes.
I was looking for the bit of judgment.
Yep.
And with, that degree of flexibility, I think so much of good decision making lies in the ability to make a free text note on your customer record management system.
Yes.
But all of that is pathologized by business process, which sort of says, efficiency, automation. So it's kind of ironic, That's a funny question you managed to get,
I love it.
get me with there.
It is. It's like the checkbox version of decision making versus kind of the thinking through the issues. And I actually think like ChatGPT is a useful reference here because that's something that kind of generative AI is taking us to a different place where you don't have to have formulaic business rules, but you have a different kind of danger associated with just spitting it into a large language model and it spits something out.
And I think the most dangerous thing is the way that data feeds itself.
Yes.
It hands us back the reality that we're comfortable with, that we defined in, and it accelerates it. So you end up with patterns of decision making that look a lot like our social media video, those black holes of videos that are sources of misogyny and things like that. So like we kind of, the point about data very often for public service has surely got to be that it's what you want to change.
Yes.
And it speaks to what's not in the data set is vital. But we're jumping too
ahead.
deep.
That's all right. Don't worry.
That's a forward trace of bit of sizzle.
Exactly right. All right. So you mentioned to me that one of the things you really think about is how do you ensure that your students are interested in a future in the public service. I do want to return to that at the end, but maybe could you just talk to me a little bit about how your relationship with your students and your teaching of your students leads you in some ways to the work on Robodebt?
Oh, well, I mean, so the first robot I ever met was a student looking for an extension. There was always, for us as law lecturers, one little footnote to all this was if you get a debt to Centrelink and you're seeking admission to the legal profession, you have to explain what created the debt. So it always had enormous sensitivity because I think it's the second highest declared form of event in the professional accreditation process.
Fascinating.
And so that always got our goat as law teachers because there would be people, you needed to be able to explain precisely what the character of your failure was. And of course, we were actually confronting the failure of the government, which is a real, like when you think about how that felt for the students, you've got all the, a lot of our students are first in the family, they're trying to work, trying to pay a rent currently.
Yes.
And you've got all that stress.
Yeah.
Plus, you've got the sort of Damocles hanging over you when you get a letter like this where it echoes into where you're trying to get to.
Yeah, wow.
And I think for us as educators, one of the things we need to take out from Robodebt is the importance of thinking about merit, because, obviously that student got an extension from me. They did not get a remedy from me, because they got it quashed because they kept appealing formally.
Yeah.
But that was a long road.
Yes.
It's not like they were able to get dispensation from the department in 2017. So there was no hot tip I could give them to get out of the situation. They had to do the grind that only a minority of people did. Just 0.8 of people ever stuck at it to disprove the debt in a formal appeal.
What's that stat? 0.8% was it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
when we're talking about, when we talk about this massive, unprecedented civil society campaign, this effort to drive awareness around Robodebt, coming up with the moniker Robodebt, what's really confronting is it still didn't defeat the most powerful force in our social security system, which is inertia, which is people copying it, people triaging their way through the process. Because 99.2% of these debts are accurate. That was the statement of the department right to the very end, because so few were reaching out of the department into the independent tribunal system. And for that student, and for every student that I met, wherever they went to law school or whatever degree they were doing, when they got one of these debts, it distorted so much of their lives.
Yeah.
It placed ambient stress at a key point in their lives. And they'll never get that time back. The assignment that student eventually submitted, what did it reflect?
Yeah.
It didn't reflect merit. It didn't reflect what we as a society needed. And it's like a little microcosm for the entire program and the way it pursued these debts in a way that endangered the outcomes of the social security system.
And it makes me think as well, how I was a law student once, although I didn't finish. But I remember thinking that the legal system was the kind of be all and end all and the legal arbiter, and that everything would work out in the end. And there's something so powerless about the way you tell that story, where you're like, you can see the system from the outside, you can see the whole thing, you can see that it's wrong, and you had literally no ability to make that change.
And one thing I've been thinking about a lot is what the greatest administrative lawyer of all time would make of it. Now I'm dramatically pausing. Who is
the greatest administrator?
Who is this? It's Dr. Franz Kafka, Caroline.
Excellent call.
Because he was recorded when he received his doctorate of jurisprudence. He's recorded as receiving it with a sigh. Because one of the things, we don't want to have a legal conversation, and that's one of the things definitely there's very little law in Robodebt. It's basically a slide. It's a slide on my undergraduate curriculum.
Yeah.
I didn't actually think there was a law review article in it.
Yeah. Too easy.
Because it was all about the power, the dynamics that are in it are staggering, because it really is. I mean, Angus Scott for the commission would just fold his arms and he would say, "You are familiar with the no evidence principle." And then, and then Justin Gregory I would regularly, watching the Royal Commission and watching Justin Gregory KC, it embodied it all for me, my total ineffectiveness and loss of power, because, I was so marginal to the whole thing. I couldn't even get a debt changed on behalf of that student. Yeah. And Justin Gregory would just take every witness and he would say, "And of course, it's that simple."
He did.
And I would just be screaming at the TV. I would just be like, "It wasn't that simple when you were living it. We were, And for me, right, why do I go to Kafka? Well, I think Kafka is is a scholar of public administration. I think too much of our we reduce him to a pop culture adjective, Kafkaesque. I think he's a better thinker, a more accurate thinker about public administration than Max Weber, which we can get into. I mean, we can
happy
really
to go there.
we can bring totally just nerd and geek out. But Kafka has this wonderful parable, Before the Law, and he talks about the person sitting outside the building where they will access the law, and there's a gatekeeper. And the person spends their whole life until the moment of their death trying to gain access. And the gatekeeper is saying things like, I'm only the first gatekeeper. Yeah. You should see the third one. When I see the third one, I'm terrified.
Yeah.
And this language of before the law is beautiful too, because, you're before the law, we can see its power, but you're also not there yet. Yeah. Yes. And that's the space this program created, in the sense it was managed in action.
Yes.
So you had to fling yourself onto this machine with your payslips, and if you sent the payslips, it all got raptured. There was no accountability.
Yeah.
If you didn't have the payslips, which so many people didn't, you were on a treadmill of years waiting for a tribunal, and even at the end of that, you would get a debt that was raptured. You would never. Yeah. It was forever receding.
Yes.
And it was Kafkaesque, and that the reality of governance by complaint is what we need to look at. So I was heartened when the Services Australia representative at the Royal Commission,
Chris Bearer?
Chris Bearer, the always affable Chris Bearer.
I thought he was an outstanding public servant. No,
I thought, I mean, I think I said it to Rick. I said, he wasn't just behind the 8 ball. He was surrounded by 8 balls, right? Because the starting position is he's having to speak to the largest settlement between a government and its citizens that I can find. That's the starting point. 2 billion worth of debt settled. It's not some of the lower figures. It's the actual debt value. And that's his starting point. And one of the things that he recognized straight away was the most disappointing aspect of this was we weren't attempting to get these debts right at first instance.
Yes.
That it was, here's a provisional answer, an abbreviated process. You can come at us with the evidence you have, and we'll change what we have. And we are a reactive. It was almost an Amazon or a sort of an online checkout. But it was gladiatorial, but it was this platform governance where you react to the evidence that is uploaded to you. And the danger, of course, with that is you are not supporting. You are not analysing. The person is in a Kafkaesque situation where they are sending things off into a process they do not understand. And I was heartened that he recognised that, and that, Kaurna, it's really important to say that point exists independently of whether the thing was lawful or not.
Yes.
Which is key. That if we say that your ability to get evidence into our hands is everything. What that means for people in free text situations I was in, what that means for people with limited capacity is really devastating. And throughout the commission, I mean, I always tried to say that administrative burden was a key concept to understand and put into the Robodebt debate, and I'm not sure it ever got the cut through I wanted, but Hurd and Moynihan, the work that they've done as academics on administrative burden and how it shapes outcomes and shapes policies, and the need to open up that space, that's for those of your listeners who are not administrative lawyers and want to see this as a public administration challenge. that is a place I always point to, that the burden put on people here was extraordinary.
Yeah.
And the reality as well was, if we go right back, the burden on them to report first day, 6 or 7 years after the debt was created, it was impossible to do the right thing in the old system of reporting we had. So, and we know that now because there's been sort of a new category of debt, these income apportionment debts that got announced after the commission. And the key thing to take away from those debts is that whenever people reported their figures correctly, they were actually being allocated incorrectly.
So you literally couldn't make the system tell the truth of your situation.
Like when you were reporting, when you were on payment, when you handed over your payslip, it wasn't being handled fairly. And that's, I mean, there's a very big difference between that. You know, they made a big thing when the Ombudsman put out his report on those debts to say totally different from Robodebt. But the one connection is that the way that we were calculating payments and struggling with payslip evidence is a common thread.
I'd like to zoom out from the experience of the individual standing before the law just a little bit and get you to talk about your experience as a kind of expert commentator. And kind of, I know you have some reflections on how random and weird it is that you become the expert commentator, but also I'm thinking about obviously the activists, but even like Louise McLeod in the Ombudsman's office, thinking about how that ability to see the bigger picture was stymied by the process as well. And it just kind of your reflections on what it was like to be in that situation and how you tried to get information or how that didn't work for you.
Well, it was so hard to put your hand on a fact. And that's like things we should remember about the wilderness years.
Yeah.
You did not know how much these were averaged. And you mentioned Louise McLeod in your question. And that moment when it's never nice when someone cries, but it was a very powerful thing. And the moment Miss McLeod broke down at the commission was the moment she saw internal emails where the department had used data engineers to get a figure for how prevalent averaging was.
Yeah.
And it was in 76% of the cases. And I can say that had that fact been in the public record in January 2017, it would have changed an awful lot.
What's your reaction to that information not having been disclosed to the Ombudsman's office?
I find it upsetting.
Why is that?
Did the Ombudsman's office press for it?
We didn't know. Well, we did ask the question, but we were told by DHS that they hadn't done.
They didn't have that information?
They didn't have that information.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I interrupted Mr. Scott. You said you found it upsetting and he asked you why.
Well, 76%, it confirms that it was very much the default.
Who told you, who at DHS, or were you personally told by someone at DHS they didn't have that information?
There was... Sorry, give me a minute.
Do you need a minute? It's obviously quite upsetting for you. We can break for 5 minutes if you would like that. Okay, 5-minute break.
Because what the technique here, the communications technique that was used by the department was to present averaging as this unfortunate reality produced by the person's very often moral failure.
Moral failure, absolutely. Their laziness, their poor record keeping.
And bear in mind that, like, I have the materials that people were given in 2011 when they were reporting, and all of those say, keep your payslips for 6 months. Do not copy your payslips. which may
You are
surprise
kidding.
people.
Sorry, I wish there was a video of this. They would have seen my face on that. You are kidding.
And for me, and for people, not just for me, it's because it's not an academic thing. This is about what it's like to be in the system. And if that experience, the experiences of people had been front and centre, like Peter Whiteford's report, Professor Peter Whiteford at the ANU, the report he did for the Royal Commission is absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
Because it says 93% of these people were not earning consistently, and the starting point assumption, the machine that was put in front of them, that they were told to stop the wheels turning, to throw themselves on. It was going to be unjust 93% of the time, the starting point, the average, the assumption they were earning consistently. And how was that so invisible in 2017? It was all about the what about.
Yeah.
And whataboutism is particularly poisonous. It's a technique that's associated with the worst of politics, I think.
Yeah.
It sort of says, you try and raise a legitimate issue, which is this averaging assumption is garbage.
Yeah.
And the answer is not to engage on that. The answer is to say, well, they deserved it. And when you look at all the words that were thrown at Robodebt in the initial outcry, they do amount to, if the person cooperates,
Yes.
we seek the person to cooperate.
We beseech.
There was a
Catherine Campbell, she makes it sound like it was a moral quest to seek engagement.
And I can say, right, the pay slips were never there. It's remarkable because one of the things that I always wanted was the union movement perhaps to be a bit, the CPSU were very strong.
Yeah.
Couldn't have been stronger.
They were amazing.
Right? They were utterly amazing. But the broader union movement could have, as soon as you said to people, I was still surprising people in 2019 in media interviews. I'd say to journalists, you have to be working to get a Robodebt, to have been working. And some journalists were surprised when I said that, because the dominant image of the programme was bludgeoning, debts, very superficial. The connection between the idea all of these people had to be working, they were the working poor, that didn't get across, because there was a snatching and a superficiality to all coverage, which was welfare debt and all the cultural images and ghosts that attached to that. And it's ultimately a testament to the power of stereotypes that the most dangerous stereotype, Caroline, I've sort of been reflecting on how do we tackle these, because the most dangerous stereotype are the ones that make us feel good about ourselves. Because when you look at how people talked about Robodebt, it was, we are a generous people.
Yes.
But people look to take advantage.
That's right. And we can afford our generosity by being careful.
There's this metaphor, so that stereotypes are the interplay. Vava, who's a cultural theorist, I did my PhD on housing rights and discrimination, so this is where this is coming from. But Vava is a cultural theorist who talked about colonialism and the structure of stereotype. And I was looking at the Irish travelling community, who are a minority and an extremely excluded minority in Ireland. And I was looking at how did Ireland, whose identity is anti-colonialist, who would have a lot to say about the Westminster tradition, frankly.
I was thinking that, actually.
I might snark at your podcast name. How did Ireland engage in a colonial project towards its own minority? And the reason is stereotypes are not name-calling. They're very specific forms of authority. So when we talk about the dole bludger in Australia or welfare cop, the first image we put in is the metaphor, which is this is a generous social security system that helps people. Now, I'd love to attack that with a bit of context. But no, it's a metaphor.
That's good.
And that's the first healing metaphor. It's like our civilizing mission. And then underneath it, then the contextual stuff is the fraud statistics, which, as Holmes said, are minuscule.
Yes.
Those get an outsized role. That bit of context gets pulled up.
Yeah.
And we are being undercut. We are being attacked. And every time it's the interplay between the two ideas of a generous social security system and this undermining that had the force. And the program itself literally mapped to the stereotype, in the sense there was this, we are generous people, but look at this pivot. And it was a very, Holmes, I was so happy when the language of stigma featured in the report.
Yes.
I was a bit disappointed that some of the literature around stigma and some of the empirical studies around stigma weren't brought out. So the commission was very much a forensic Royal Commission.
Yeah.
It's a forensic miracle what they did.
Yeah.
900,000 documents, how they did it. And what they did is irreplaceable. So much of the commission was done in the hearing, in the oral accounts, in the marrying up of the examinations of people.
Yeah.
It was so skillful.
Yes.
So I'm not going to pop on a podcast and say, well,
They should have.
You should have. Where, because it wasn't.
Where was Foucault in this examination? I do not see Derrida. Yep.
Yeah, but it's just a quirk that the concept of stigma is actually becoming more prevalent in the literature around social security, and the main international cooperation body amongst social security public administration this year focused on stigma as its main thing. And do you know what I found when we were talking about visibility and stereotypes and how fraud is made hyper visible to the point of utter distortion? Do you know what's invisible? Is exactly what the 14 people who appeared before the commission, just 14 victims, got space. And I would say, in my darker moments, I say to myself, the last thing the Australian Public Service did to Robodebt victims, this is a bit harsh, was make it about themselves. Because we've got so many public servants. We've got, how many projects are going to be about public service reform now?
All of them.
And what's devastating to me is I count 11 recommendations that are about people on social security and their situation. And in the commission as a whole, there were 14 people. 14 victims and families of victims. And for me, post-commission, I want to I'm not going to be I'm sort of retired from public life now, but I wanted to, the last sighting of me needed to be me walking over towards the 11 recommendations about social security, talking about the role stigma played in this and the accounts of those 14 people, because those accounts raised one core dynamic, which was, I'm never seeking assistance from this organisation again.
Yep, they have broken my faith in the idea that there is some social contract of which I can partake. I am excluded from that.
Where's our metaphor now? Where's our, we've bounced, now we're doing the valuable stuff, which is what Holmes does in her preface, which is look at the bigger picture here. Don't forget the bigger picture here. I loved the preface. I loved the way she bounced out to the job seeker call. And she did that, I think, not, it's just consider raising job seeker, but she did it pointedly.
Yes.
I think, because the bigger picture is what was lost. The bigger picture is what is never in the public domain. And for me, right, one of the experiences I had talking to the media and talking about the program was so many people came for the tech, for the automation, for so many people are now coming for the public service reform.
Yep, myself included, right? And that's been a real challenge for us, is we've been challenged by how much are we part of the smug cake-eating professional learning conference agenda, and how much are we
But it's really confronting,
It is.
right? Like this podcast, let's just out this.
Yeah.
The podcast you and I are now sort of conducting, we are positioning what the report names as irreparable harm. Harm beyond reparation, because there's no compensation scheme that can be made functional.
Yes.
We're positioning that as a teachable moment.
Yeah.
There's enormous erasure and silencing to that.
Yeah.
And like, I struggle still, I want to use the present tense, with anyone calling me a campaigner, anyone who pivots off what I think might be the core reality, that I'm not confident that people are coming for the Social Security when the response comes out.
Yeah.
I'm not confident that recommendation 1, which is this broad, in the clear request to change the way we deliver Social Security in this country.
Yeah.
The fact that it's general means it's a downside.
Yeah. It's hard to implement.
Because
hard
it's
to
hard
write
to
a little
implement because,
plan that says
like
X,
basically
Y, Z.
shopping lists.
Yeah.
And like, and I mean, that'll be very hard to take, because I do look at the report and say, right, well, what's the palpable thing? And I made a mistake, Caroline, right? So I knew, like, I made a serious mistake for my, like, well-being, right? Because I was asked to do the conversation reaction piece,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So they said, okay, we want to get your take on the hot take, right? And I had a plan the day before which involved, right, I'm going to focus on what are the recommendations saying to victims? What will you be able to do? What extra powers will you have to call out errors?
Yeah.
What extra protections will you have? And what I found really confronting was I couldn't write the piece in the format I wanted when the report came out, because the report is one that shows it vests extraordinary trust in the public service.
Yeah.
It says your exercise of power has got to be better.
Yeah.
It's not a report that leads with fresh rights for people on Social Security.
Yeah. Which would have been another way, wouldn't it? Like, now that you say that.
Well, when the Disability Royal Commission came out, as you know, and that's a very different. Like, I think we could,
Yes.
but when the Disability Royal Commission came out, I think put the two side by side, and there's a strong contrast in terms of like where the addressees, literally at that level.
Yes. Who is this going to?
And like, that's why when we talk to this Westminster tradition, and we are talking to public servants, Robodebt's never going to mean, Robodebt's never going to mean to others what it meant to me, but it really has to mean something. And it really is on every public servant, because they are named as the key implementers, because there's no big project of law reform. There's actually so few legislative amendments in any of these.
No, it's modest.
And restrained,
Yes.
like generous and restrained.
Oh, that's the
how
better
I
way of
described
putting
it to one person.
Absolutely, you're right.
Now, and that's really hard for me, because one of the things I sort of realised was, there's a recommendation in there to publish more AATs, tribunal decisions, and I'm like, I had this like personal reaction where I was like, I can't do it anymore. Like, I can't.
Yeah.
You really feel very much on the outside when you're trying to press a tribunal decision, knowing that you'll never see what the reaction is to it, and it's hard to have faith. And we are, like, as an outsider of the public, as an outsider, we are asked to trust I do think that when I look at the recommendations, and to put our trust in the ability of my students, and that's where I turn to optimism.
Yeah.
Because 20 to 30% of my administrative law class every year are going to be
Public
servants. But yeah,
I want to pause on that a little bit because there was something for me about, I know Rick Morton said in a number of his interviews, it's only that it's illegal that this got caught, and that our culture around social security is so toxic that actually all they would have needed to do was to pass a piece of legislation in Parliament to get Robodebt made legal, to literally, say we will also happily accept this as a version of apportionment afterwards. And I was very sceptical about that idea. I was like, I just can't see the Senate passing that. And then I was thinking about some of the things you said to me, and that is less well known. I'd really like you to talk us through in a bit of detail about the time after they know Robodebt is illegal, and when they're preparing all those submissions for Cabinet about alternative options of what they might be able to do. And I think that's that space where the public servants really acted in alignment with the intention of their ministers. There's something about they tried to find legal fixes to keep doing the thing they were doing. And I found that incredibly uncomfortable as you told me about it. So do you want to sort of talk us through, after Amato, what are some of the things they thought they might be able to get up?
Well, this is it's a bit unique because the Commission did stop dead at Amato. And this goes back to looking at that time, the Amato time. People forget that the defence of the programme in the Senate continued and strengthened in 2019. And people were called ostriches, which I always found was a particular low point. That because an ostrich doesn't, when it sticks its head in the sand, first of all, it doesn't go all the way into the sand. But when an ostrich does that, it's terrified. So, I mean, there's something very dark about that moment when people were citing the ostrich effect, that people were turning their back on the letters.
Yeah.
And when we look at that Amato time, I was struck by how many people thought it was over the second Victoria Legal Aid won that case.
Yeah.
Now, it was over in some senses, in the sense solely average deaths were gone and gone forever.
Yeah.
But my money was very much on them looking to engage that language.
Looking to engage. Seeking to engage.
Seeking to engage with people. And the most likely form I think that was going to take was calling people up and asking them to make representations about their earning patterns 6 or 7 years ago, and reiterating to them the very strong powers that exist around misrepresentation.
Yeah.
And so when I got the Amato judgment, I was like, well, better time to make this hurt. That was what I was saying to people, that got to make this hurt, got to make this a moment, because one of the details that came out in the Ombudsman's report after all this, 2021 Ombudsman's report, was initially the department did not want to refund instances where the person accepted the average. And the Ombudsman persuaded them to refund those cases. And for me, knowing how scared people are, knowing how uninformed, and that was the key bit of internal research we got, that people did not understand these decisions.
Yeah.
And there was a devastating exchange in the Commission about that. The internal report came out that the department decision makers were aware that people's understanding was not there.
Yeah. The commentary in that evidence is, he outright says it's the school system's fault that people don't understand averaging, but the implication is it's not my fault people are too stupid to understand the thing I'm telling them.
Well, I think what we were getting out of this user testing is they didn't understand averaging, so it was hard then to be able to say we're going to average the ATA data for anyone to comprehend what that meant.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That only 2 participants could understood after reading the then current letter
Yeah.
that they were at risk of their entitlements being calculated on an assumption that they earned their income in equal amounts for each fortnight under consideration.
Yep.
Didn't that tell you that there was a fundamental problem with the program?
Told me there's a fundamental problem with the Australian education system where people can't understand averaging. It's pretty poor that people can't understand adding numbers up and dividing by the weeks actually is an average. That's pretty appalling. But that's where we're at as a society, so there you go. I've still got to communicate with those people. I've still got to explain. This was a very difficult process because we wanted to explain it to people, but essentially it was very difficult to do. We sort of had to explain averaging first and then the application of averaging. So I had to do both, not just the application of averaging. And that's pretty difficult for us to do.
But the point of the initiation letters surely was to put customers on notice of what might happen to those customers and their entitlements if they didn't engage with the process.
Yeah, no, that's what we were trying to do. We just hadn't been able to formulate a set of words that people generally could understand when it came to averaging.
And as at the 28th of March 2019, a matter of months from when the Solicitor General's advice was provided and the program was brought to an end,
Yep.
the program was manifestly failing to put recipients on notice of what they were at risk of if they didn't engage in the process.
Well, I think we were giving them that information. It's whether they were able to comprehend it is the issue. So I was telling them what they needed to hear. Were they able to easily comprehend it? No.
Surely the object of these letters was to ensure that they did comprehend.
Yes, but these letters went through an enormous amount of work, especially with the Ombudsman's office. Every Tom, Dick and Harry had a view on different words, but they just didn't work. That's the bottom line. If someone has some better words out there, that would be great, but we couldn't find a set of words where people could understand averaging. That was the problem. And in the end, I moved forward with putting the flyer out, even though it doesn't use a test that well, because I think it's better to put it out there and have at least it allows people to show it to other people and possibly to have someone else explain it to them or bring it into a service centre and have it explained to them. That was a better outcome than nothing. But I can't overcome the fact that people don't understand the concept of averaging.
Yeah, and again, that isn't, I think it's important to say that isn't misconduct or anything.
No.
That a public servant can hold that view. That's a service delivery view. Mm-hmm. And it was incredibly confronting because these debts were coming into people's lives, and we speak abstractly about so much in the program, this Robodebt moniker, which has its upsides and downsides. Like that image, some of the images of people would get the debt and they'd hide it from their partner. That's what this was. Yeah. That's what this was. The shame. And the fear. Yeah. There was a devastating... one of the Senate inquiry hearings in 2019 in Law System, I could hardly read it because I switched it off in real time, and I could hardly read it afterwards because we were talking about what it's like to get a debt in a situation of active domestic violence.
Oh, Jesus.
And that comes first, Caroline.
Yeah.
So, like, safety comes first.
Yeah.
Your health comes first.
Yeah.
Your family getting out the door in the morning comes first. People caught the deaths because they were line 20 on a ledger of pain and getting through the day and the hardest time of your life and what it is to be on the margins, you know. And like, I think for all of us then, like, what do we expect from public servants? For me, we needed to see a commitment to get the facts and to communicate the facts. And do you know why they were unable to call the people up in the end?
Yeah.
It's because they got buried underneath the numbers, the amount of deaths they had produced, and they couldn't pick out 50,000 highest value ones to make an example of, to make the program seem worth it, right? That's what if I was a grizzled political staffer, that's what I would have been telling the minister. I would have been telling the minister, find me the 50,000 most expensive debts, inverted
and let's
commas.
get those ones.
Call them up, because in the heart of this mountain, this unlawful debt mountain, is the old program.
Yeah.
There's 10,000 there that we used to do. Let's connect it back to that. And look, we can say to the others, you know, that's the game.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it was they couldn't do it.
Yes.
Because they never recorded which debts were averaged in a way that allowed them to put their hands on those debts fast. So it took 849 members of staff 3 months just to count all the unlawfulness. And that makes me sort of smile.
Yeah.
Because of the hubris of it, right?
Yeah.
But also, it also tells me how far the Australian Public Service were from neutral policy evaluation. On what basis could you not tell me key facts about this program? The facts we needed to have an ethical conversation, we only ended up having in the Royal Commission. So we didn't know how many deaths were averaged, and poor Louise MacLeod ends up crying in a Royal Commission. Another fact that came out, it took 3 years to find out that the department had used its information gathering powers to go get payslips for people 570 times. That came out in the middle of 2019.
Yeah.
And those 570 weren't ordered by the department. They were ordered by the tribunal. And when I read that in 2019, that they'd only gone and gotten the payslips they'd only gone and gotten 570 payslips.
Yeah.
Right? It's not even, because most people had like 3 or 4 employers in their Robodebt.
Yeah.
So that's not even people.
Yeah.
So like, we're talking about a couple of hundred out of 433,000. And I was just, I read, because it was disclosed by the Ombudsman in a one-liner in 2019.
Yeah.
I was like, we don't know how many are average, but this tells us it's hundreds of thousands. And then when Amato comes down, the minister comes out and says, it's a small cohort of Australians.
That is.
And I'm like, well, he was able to say it because the fact wasn't to hand.
And so I think this is you're helping me unpick something here, Darren, because one of the things we've been grappling with in how we set up a future episode on morality/ethics/values, right, is we've been thinking about, ethics are easy. You've got professional ethics, which are in some way bounded and they're kind of written down for us, impartial, responsive, honest, blah, blah, blah. Then there's morality, which is harder. And you'll hear even in this interview where I'm kind of skating around the edges of what I say publicly about what I think is moral or immoral, because you work for the government of the day and you deliver ethically. But what I love about your framing of what you want from public servants, what did you want from public servants in this context, was honesty, was commitment to actually being honest about evaluation, about doing the work to understand the impact of the things that we're doing. That to me very squares easily. I have no problem saying that on a podcast, that I expect that of any public servant who works for any stripe of government. But maybe what else do you expect of public servants in that framing?
So I think securing the facts is vital. And when we look at the evidence of Secretary Leon in particular, now we knew. I mean, it's remarkable the sample that the Commission has taken. And a lot of people will look at this and say, well, we don't want Robodebt to define us as a public service.
Yeah.
And that's a reaction I'm afraid of, where the response to the report is mixed into other projects and it gets diluted. But you need to respect the quality of the sample Commissioner Holmes was exposed to. We're talking about very contrasting secretaries.
Yes.
See, you laugh,
Sorry.
but everyone in Canberra will laugh, because that was very much the point of their evidence. Even you're taking possibly two ends of a spectrum there,
and you're taking somewhere in between, right?
And you're taking two institutions who have distinct internal cultures and distinct public service philosophies. I think We Know Boats plays speculative invoicing, perhaps. But for me, Secretary Leon was always going to be a key witness. And one of the things that I really think every public servant needs to confront about what she told us was the ambient level of politicization in the briefs that go up.
Yeah.
She was so strong on that she said, everything in a brief to a minister, it won't be framed in terms of this is the impact the policy is having.
Yeah.
It'll be coded through phrases like community concern. And that was an enormously significant point, I thought, because the way in which, first of all, in order for us to have an ethical debate, what are the preconditions? How does the public service fulfill its obligation to resource ministerial decisions, parliamentary debate, and our democratic contestation?
Yeah.
We all agree we can't bend on the facts. I'm here to tell you all that, first of all, so often the facts did not exist.
Yeah.
And there is no one can ever persuade me that there was any objective, acceptable reason to not record how much averaging was going on. In fact, if people felt what they were saying in public, it was the key data point to report on. Then to not know the reasons when you're helping people.
Yeah.
So those 570 times they went and helped someone by getting pay slips, they weren't able to say whether it was in response to a mental health incident. And I could count to 570 of the tribunal decisions I knew where the tribunal ordered the gathering of pay slips. So all of a sudden, there's no reality being captured that could be communicated. Secretary Leon is telling us that reality is refracted.
Yeah.
Then the next level on is the way the briefing never occurs, the way information fails to get escalated, the way in which risk is not managed. And that is, we're going to spend some time, I think, Caroline, on that. Like, we're going to have a conversation. I mean, we can't do it all in one go. But where I would start is, it's really important that public servants coming out of this commission understand that this isn't just about APS internal culture. It's also about legislative obligation.
Yes.
Now, I don't mean to intimidate.
Do you?
But the one thing, if you streamed any bit of the commission, the one thing that a public servant should have gotten out of it was, I need to know more about my obligation to escalate matters. I need to know what a misleading statement is. I am in a state of actively worrying about students and even members of my family based on watching the commission.
Yeah.
Because you've got to have, like, it was striking. There were witnesses in this commission who were devastated at what was unfolding in the questioning because they had not conceived of things this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we need to it's, we talk about ethics and ethical values, but there's a hard legal framework applies to these interactions. Like the public governance and public accountability framework, that's a legal obligation. And there's an obligation on secretaries personally to escalate risk.
Yeah.
And then there are obligations of good faith. And I guess we're on the idea then of, like, we're arriving at the idea of why didn't people speak out? Like, if we just enter at that level of generality, so you have these legal obligations, Caroline, and we can give you a massive lecture that'll be very intimidating, to anyone listening. But what stopped people speaking out, and what were the things that got people speaking? Mm-hmm. And is there something in the structures of a bureaucracy that leads to things like Robodebt? And what might those things be?
You have this great
putting that in front of you,
where you talk about a presumption of regularity. I presume it's not just your language. I presume it's an academic term.
This is a concept.
Yeah.
So this is a doctrine in judicial reviews that when a court is looking at a government decision, it presumes that a government department is functioning regularly. So it's a favourable assumption. It's a favourable assumption made about government departments.
And it's something we assume internally is kind of what you've done, is you've said, yep, and everyone acting inside the public service operated on that presumption as well.
Yeah, and I think, so like if we layer up all the things that fed into the 4 years of inaction and silence, and even some of the adverse findings, I think when we look and name the broad dynamics, the timeless dynamics that are going to be present in every public service organisation that need to be tackled, need to be outed.
Yeah.
The first is that idea of this presumption of regularity. So one of the witnesses, and you can see I avoid names because I prefer avoid, a lot of people went in there to that commission, had the worst day of their professional lives. Some of them performed really important acts on behalf of the public service. Yeah. So some of the EL1s and EL2s, I'm tempted to name them. I did in a piece for the Mandarin. Like, I thought some of the most important contributions, Melanie Metz was extraordinary in talking about what it's like to work all your life in a career and feel like it's slipping away and it's being taken away, and to be at the whims of leadership. Yeah. And I know everyone, that was on the last day of the Royal Commission, she had to do that, and it was incredibly courageous. We've already mentioned Louise MacLeod, who, on behalf of other staff and the Ombudsman, embodies the way people are carry the can. Yeah. Carry the can visibly, can be so often the public face of something that they wanted so differently. And that's a very specific, a very specific form of bureaucratic harm, is you have to front up. Yep. It's your role to front up for that, and so she was extraordinary. Kristen Lumley, who showed immense courage to send a written email, a few written emails saying, it's not right, I don't feel right. And, we're arriving at some of the more higher profile people then, but I just wanted to mention
I think that's exactly right.
I think the ATO guys were extraordinary. I would pull up a stool and commiserate with the Australian Taxation Office officials, and it was showed in their emails too. And there's one answer actually by Michael Kerr Brown that was so honest when he talks about the conception of the Australian Tax Office, the Gregory asked him, as an independent entity, isn't the Australian Tax Office the perfect institution to kill this thing? And Kerr Brown just said, yes and no.
Exactly.
And
right.
I commend his explanation to every public servant as a really good description of institutional interaction, concepts of policy ownership.
Yeah.
At that point earlier, you said that, you were asked whether the ATO wasn't the perfect voice to stand up to DHS pushback, and you said yes and no. What was the yes and what was the no?
Again, as a statutory authority answerable to Parliament rather than a minister, we, in terms of the public service, have a degree of independence that's probably not available to departments that have secretaries. But I was also mindful that the government had provided us funding through the budget and my EFO processes, which made it then problematic for us not to provide the data for the specific budget measures.
So how is that problematic? You've got this funding. Is it likely to be clawed back, or what will happen if, having got the funding, you say this just isn't working, we're not doing it?
Because the funding was over multiple years, it just meant that we wouldn't have got the funding, and we wouldn't have needed that funding if we weren't providing the data. But the implication of that is that the Commissioner can then be accused of making a unilateral decision to cost the budget bottom line $1.2 billion.
And that took tremendous courage.
It did, didn't it?
Because it was the week of Scott Morrison's evidence, and there was an environment on social media that was absolutely so. I mean, I locked my account at points during the Royal Commission, and one of the reasons I did was when we had people like the people I've just mentioned appearing, if anything was positive was said, an absolute storm.
Yeah. Just pile on of vitriol.
And not actually, and what frustrated me was it wasn't actually the people who were engaged with the Commission that I knew, as in the people who were actually advocates and might be, it was sort of people trying to build up to the politician's appearance. So that saddens me because, actually, I should say very clearly, even on your podcast, that I've left social media because I don't think, and even though the Commissioner did a shout out to me at the last day, I think it's reached its tipping point.
But without it, the coverage would... Anyway, we could pause longer on the politics of the coverage.
But I just wanted to say that this, I do think the transcripts represent a very subtle resource, and Holmes in her final report had to do a massive TikTok and blow by blow, and she was, she focused on what Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, calls the second-rate question, which is who knew what when? The knowledge question. And what we know is the knowledge question, if you focus on it, is not going to give us the change. Because we've got to talk about the dynamics we're going to talk about now. And the first one of those is this idea of we are correct because we are the department. And one of the witnesses, Tim French, talked about when he first shared the first formal advice. So this is in March for Madeleine Masterton's case. So, we're still 8 months out from the end of the programme. and the advice is, could be in trouble here. Going to have to make this case is probably going to have to be settled.
I love that it's called the prospects advice, because it sounds like a marriage prospects in Jane Austen. And it's like, don't marry this. This is not where you should go, don't you think? Like the prospects advice. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. And the forecast was not great. But what he says was, when he told the broad corporate group, so this is not people who were hands-on in Robodebt, when he shared that, he said there were gasps.
Yeah.
And I'm fascinated by that moment, right? Because how can there be gasps?
I don't think the department... I think people in the department sincerely believed that Robodebt was lawful. I don't know whether that's the case with the secretary. And I say that because when the advice on prospects was handed down and I spoke about it in a meeting, there were audible gasps in the room when I said that the department's prospects on the basis of this advice were poor. So I'm not sure that... I think the department was overstating its position.
I am fascinated by that, because as a public servant, I'm so used to being wrong, right? Like I am so used to, in service delivery land, a family telling me, you know how you told me if you apply there, that's what happens. That's not what happens at all. Like my whole life is experiencing the way in which my understanding of the system is wrong. So I am fascinated. It's not just... You have to be willfully wanting to believe that you're always right. You have to ignore so much evidence of your normal professional life to think that the department is always right.
And I think, I think it was the investment, the visible investment the department had made.
Yes, okay.
And this is kind of a little bit, this speaks about how important, when a controversy first escalates, how important it is to get that escalation right.
Yep.
Because if something goes up and sticking to our guns comes back, that's what produces the gap.
Yes, that's exactly right. You're exactly right.
Because it's like everyone's seen something bubble up and gone, oh my God. But when something comes up and gets vested with this authority, and what's really interesting, Caroline, is how little visibility there is to people lower down of what's happened up high.
Yes.
And people have talked privately to me. One of the main things I've heard from public servants who, I speak to is we've just got to get more speak up culture. All right? Where's our speak up culture in our organisation? We're all working on that. But
what about
throughout Robodebt, the word broadly, the word went up. Because if it wasn't the people internally, it was the media.
Yeah, absolutely.
The damage was fragmentary knowledge where people thought this was before cabinet.
Yeah.
So this had all this work done on it.
Yeah.
Sure, no way. This went up. No way. And that's the danger of inherent authority.
Yeah.
All right. So the idea of you're judging things off of who's touched it, how high it's got.
Yes.
And Robodebt's a warning about the importance of speak down, where knowledge of everything that's happened is shared more broadly. Now, there are powerful incentives against that, where leaking, there's a sort of command and control vibe.
Well, and Holmes goes further.
Not writing things down.
Don't you think Holmes goes further? And I think this is one of the interesting ways she walks what I find to be a really quite impactful line of not holding middle management particularly to account. She doesn't hold the EL2, SES1 in the compliance area as like the drivers. She really holds it at the Melissa Golightly and Catherine Campbell level. She goes further. She says it's not incoherence, it is active dissuasion. So she finds, when I looked at it, I didn't find conspiracy on its face. I was like, it was just lots of people not talking up and then lots of people not recognising what had been looked at the top and therefore going down. But she finds different. She finds Catherine Campbell actively stopped legal advice being requested. She actively stopped consideration of these issues. So it wasn't a function of structure. She finds agency, I guess. But do you have a place where you fall on the, I mean, Catherine Campbell aside, on the kind of structure agency question?
I would just, so I'm not going, I mean, so we'll just, I mean, we'll leave it at repeating what the Royal Commission found, and no judgment from me on that. From my point of view, one of the reasons leadership isn't accountable to those below is because of its ability to project power downwards. And I think it's not just the question of we're not taking this any further. It's the ability to generate a belief in people that it has gone further. Like when people are trying to get a read on, like I would say a lot of people at the EL1 and EL2 level would have believed that this thing had surgery done on it in January, and they were staggered by what went down. And I guess from that point of view, when we look at recovering from Robodebt, there is this point where you've got to make your leaders speak down and clearly identify what has occurred. Now, they don't have time to speak down. And this is where absence of records is huge. Because if you're an EL1 and EL2 and you're not being given the original cabinet briefing documents and you're not being given open slather to go investigate the policy you're implementing, red flag.
Oh my God, so true.
This is where... But this is where, like, you know, this is where cabinet confidentiality, cabinet, and the selective visibility of the concept of a tight hold at leadership can be very, very damaging.
Well, and there are kind of institutional things, but even, you know, so the presumption of change of government is that you don't ever look at the cabinet documents from a previous government.
A fragmentation of knowledge, and every division of. But every division of labour is a division of knowledge. And when we talk about, because we have to arrive at what was people's blockage, right? A lot of the time it's that the conditions for moral responsibility did not exist. The knowledge conditions. So we have throughout the commission, we had the epistemological defence. The foundational defence for all moral excuses is, I did not know, right? Now, when we look at that, as I say, Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, called that a second-rate way of approaching organising our society. Who knew what, right? And what we need to remember about bureaucracy is it is structured in a way that moral responsibility won't land because knowledge doesn't land. And there's four conditions, four things you need to kind of have to create a moment, right? The first thing is you need to be at a fork in the road, right? So you need to know that a decision must be made now. Very few people on the Robodebt timeline were ever locked into a situation where they personally had to make a decision. The key moments all correlated with external consequences beckoning for the person. So when were the frank and fearless moments, right? Why did Kristen Lumley send her email? Because she saw in the newspaper that Gavin Silbert, the Victorian QC, was on a warpath to get it into court. Why was there some moments in January 2017? Because the pressure was on, and because Slater and Gordon announced a possible class action, which generated an interaction around scaring the horses. So it's funny. So you have to trap the individual. They have to be trapped into a moment of moral choice. Second, they have to make it now. Because so many people in this timeline, Caroline, and this goes for particularly junior levels, the volatility of staffing and role. I was acting. I was just right.
Christmas
and so you have to be there in that moment, and you must, the clock must be about to elapse
Yep.
And you must be having to face something.
Yep.
And then you've got to know what choices. And I was fascinated by this, right? Because one of the key things that got inserted was the government was never stopping until the Solicitor General gave us advice saying no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what that was is a circumstantial threshold around acting.
Yeah.
That was never tested.
No.
Well, we can debate. Now, there was
That's true.
But certainly, right, from a legal perspective, I would have regarded that as inserting a layer on frank and fearless advice that was unnecessary.
Yeah.
And does not, I would discourage people from saying the minister's not going to listen, I'm not going to put it up.
Yep. Until...
Can we locate that?
Yeah.
Like, if we just think about that for a second, that's defeatism.
Yeah.
That doesn't serve the public. If the warning is grave enough, and when I heard the Solicitor General must say no, that was a political read.
Yeah.
And political reads, we know the world. You're trying to avoid a collision course.
Yeah.
You're trying to preserve a relationship that goes beyond the one program, the one event.
Yeah. Yeah.
We know all of that,
yeah.
right? But when it's a risk, you're getting into statutory obligation. It's a matter of risk management. This isn't about telling the minister or grading the minister's preferred policy vision as less than great. Yeah. This is a risk. Risk means action. You have to.
Yeah.
It's for your. I mean, I can say it's for yourself. No, like
that's exactly right. Because otherwise, you're in the Royal Commission doing the thing.
And then you need to have the information needed to make the decision, which we've covered. In the sense, you have to know that the other person is unaware.
Yep.
You have to know what has happened. You have to be able to push the whole thing up. And fragmented knowledge in the public service is produced by the structures.
Yeah.
It's produced by what defines. I think there have been people watching the evidence of the commission, and they have been saying, "Look, this is a judge and a barrister. They have no idea that an EL1 would never do that. An EL2 would never do that." I'm here to say, from a legal background, some of those EL1 would never do that. There's some cultural coating. There's some informality to that, because if you have knowledge in your hand and it's not going up, if it's not moving,
it's your obligation.
It's yours.
Can we work through a lived example of this one in the thing? Because the missed opportunity to kill Robodebt that just haunts me is the one where, Minister Morrison has sent back the briefing saying, yes, please go forth and sort this out. And DSS, who have a very strong and cogent moral and legal case against the program, are forced into this conversation with DHS in that kind of February meeting. And I don't really want to go into what they say in the February meeting and who lies and whatever. But I think I'm just thinking through your taxonomy. Let's just see if we can get all four elements there, right? And sort of see what's happening. Because the first element you had was you have to... Can you describe it again?
Let's just go straight at it.
Yeah.
The key thing that's missing there, I think, is it'll be on their heads. I think that may have played a role. That DSS, fundamentally, it's a DHS thing.
That's what I was thinking as well. I was thinking about your fragmentation. So it wasn't fragmentation of knowledge.
They knew, there couldn't have been at that point, as in, that's all the information is there, that's what you led into.
Yeah.
But what it was, hang on, why am I being a stick in the mud?
Yes.
And also, there's also a reported sense that when it came to it, this was two institutions, one with a secretary whom the subjective reported perception was DHS were big into this.
And will go as hard as they have to.
And this was almost a golden ticket for the organisation's sort of I mean, it's reversed the staffing trend at DHS. It increased the staff in a way that it had been falling before it. Right. So, like, it meant an awful lot to DHS. Yep. Did it mean a lot to the Secretary of DSS? Not to the point that he appeared to have a lot of awareness to.
No.
So in terms of which institution is putting their capital on their line, which institution is meeting the minister about this proposal, which institution has the ear? And that's the key. Like, when you think about the cultural capital that's key in a bureaucracy, there's one side mobilizing the idea. Even in the minute when it comes back, it's, you know, I'd like to see this if it can be sorted out, you know, and then sort of people lean into that can it be sorted out frame.
That's the thing.
All it took was a vibe. That's all that was present, was a vibe. And so that positioning instantly relieved, in some senses, take a back step. Push step forward. And that released the moral agency, potentially. And you see that people, when DSS people talk about it in 2017, or, you know, when they come back to it, it's like, this is DHS's thing. And there's this concept of ownership, moral ownership, that gets imputed at a key point. And also there's the natural reaction, I would imagine, of, we've given all these warnings. We've tagged you with paper. Like, it's a miracle that minute exists when you look at the pattern across the years. Like, when Andrew Whitecross was a key person in making that minute, executive minute,
exist,
sticking
in its
to
form,
having it exist. And what happened then across the next 4.5 years tells you the job he did was extraordinary to get that in writing.
And he had those moments, didn't he? He both identified the moment, he had a crux where he had to get it done in time. Like, there was a kind of, you know, I've got to get this done because this is going to happen up to this bit. He had the information in his head, which is so funny because then DSS forgot what they knew. They forgot what they knew about DHS.
Because he was acting.
Yes. Oh, God, it's so true. It's always the bloody acting. Oh, it's so true. I love that taxonomy, and I'm trying to work out how you kind of operationalize it as a public servant.
It's just like, because I do think, though, that, like, I operate on the basis that people are people. And I want us to operate on that basis, that in every organisation, you're going to have the same mix. We all contain multitudes. We all have the same mix of cowardice, and, you know, and when you spill all this onto the table, you see every grade of human being. It is our responsibility, Caroline, to structure our resources and to structure our organisations to reflect human nature, not to give a happy clappy corporate seminar about courage and morality and
how we should all be Colleen Taylor, which is just like such a, you know, she's lightning in a bottle, and if that's what we're relying on.
Statistically, Colleen is a unicorn.
Absolutely.
And when you look at whistleblowers, she's an absolute unicorn for her. And, you know, there was I've spoken about Zygmunt Bauman, and a lot of the stuff around distancing that I'm dipping into reflects Bauman's scholarship. Now, I'm not, you know, there's a lot more in that bucket, but I do think one thing that when you hear Colleen speak about why she spoke out, she had a proximity to the people in her work. And we know that from Bauman's work, the importance of that. And there's a quote from Bauman that when Colleen spoke about seeing Reese's paper, Reese Causo's face in the newspaper and what she felt is one of the most beautiful things. And there was a quote from Bauman where he talks about the unfounded, non-rational, non-calculable urge to stretch towards others. And Colleen just embodied that when she talks about his beautiful face. And a lot of us, like, I think Robodebt, it definitely touched something very deep in me, in my personal circumstances, that I wouldn't be talking about publicly. But I'm interested in how because it's not the case that people are unthinking and unfeeling.
No.
Because what it is it's a particular job.
Yeah.
And there are particular dynamics that accompany it.
Yeah.
Now, there are, people who are capable of great immorality, right, in every organisation, and bullying. Yeah. And, I don't mean to say that every public servant is blameless.
But it's like 3% or 5% or whatever. It's a little bit.
And not like how, I guess I am a bit disappointed that so few people felt the compulsion Colleen felt.
Yeah.
I think, why is it that people fail to engage their moral faculties and do the little bits that they could do?
Yeah.
And I think we need to have awkward conversations about that, because Nick Gill in the UK is a great academic, and he's written on the migration system. And his book, I really recommend it, is Nothing Personal, ? By Nick Gill.
Oh, that is the best title ever.
But it's also like the closeness Colleen felt to the people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Countered, it's such a powerful answer, and stands apart from all the evidence in the commission, which was, this was my role.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
I handed it over here. It went to them. That's what the thing was. Yep.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways you kind of query whether, when people go to work, there's this idea that we are a post-emotional society, which is bizarre.
Right. Yes.
Which is bizarre because we're all sharing, and God, we're all...
And we're learning so much about how brains interact with bodies, and how, literally our functions of rational thinking are impacted by our kind of feelings. But anyway.
But I think there is a sharp divide between the world of work and home. The world stays very much out there and never becomes compellingly in here. And I think that the way in which Colleen was able to make it her role is inspiring. And it's worth remembering that, and she stresses this. She got her manager's permission to send that email.
Yep.
Don't ever forget that. If you're thinking, God, I don't have the strength to be a whistleblower, remember that she got the manager's permission.
Yeah.
She was working in structure.
It was.
And that's quite powerful, but it is a bit of a reminder about what is possible. Yeah. Because a lot of people will say, that I couldn't have done more, and I think in some respects Colleen is a challenge as well as something to lean into.
I mean, I think Commissioner Holmes obviously goes a little bit to the how do you reduce that othering, how do you create that sense of connection. I'm thinking of with her recommendation around having to spend time on the front line service delivery, that everyone should actually spend time in the Centrelink offices and I kind of keep imagining these kind of troops of poor Canberra public servants kind of traipsing through the YAS office, and then all these poor people who are just there to receive a service going.
But that may not actually produce what we need to produce.
That's what I'm wondering. Do you have reflections on that?
So, ironically, it's similar to Catherine Campbell's IPAA speech in 2018 was similar in the sense you've got to do delivery if you're going to do policy, right? That has been, she was trying to say that, trying to stress that to public servants. Yeah. The problem with that is very often engaging with people day to day produces moral discomfort, but not a moral discomfort that transforms. And this is part of Gill's work as well, and others, where when people have to cope with moral discomfort at work, what actually happens with it is they lean into ideas of role. So I can't be responsible for all that.
Yes.
And ultimately, you get a vision of the world. You can burn out. And you can also... So being open at work, being open to emotion, saying this is someone who had to take a big period of... Well, I didn't take a period of rest, unfortunately. No. But watching the commission, I was devastated watching it every day. Yeah. So being open at work is really challenging. It's not necessarily healthy. Yeah. So we tend to shut down. And also in a bureaucracy, there's a drive when you're uncomfortable to put boundaries around your role, and also to kind of say, well, at least I did this much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the research on moral discomfort is very much that it doesn't window out into any great change, so that when a bureaucrat is upset at work, I keep saying bureaucrat, public servant, when a public servant witnesses upsetting things at work, it produces effects in the sense they try to negotiate street level better outcomes for the person. They try to be as good enough as they can be. Yeah. But it actually produces an overarching dynamic where you lean into the boundaries of your role and say, to keep myself going, I've got to have my boundaries up. And that's actually good advice, by the way.
Advice I have given many of my staff.
And like the idea that emotional encounters would have stopped Robodebt, I'm not sure about. It's a different kind of thing.
Well, it's about the right connection for the right person, right? Like back to your point about how do you create an architecture of moral accountability. It actually, the people who needed to have those emotional encounters weren't the people on the day-to-day frontline. It was the people, the band ones and the band twos, who are signing things through and providing the advice and responsible for, designing a system that does or doesn't capture the information that we were talking about that would make that suffering visible, right? Like you start to capture that information if you realise how meaningful it is.
And like what I sort of gave there was very wordy, right? So like,
you're Irish, so we'll just let you talk forever.
So when I talk about moral discomfort and leaning into your role, what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
I think it looks like an awful lot of the evidence in the commission where the amount of passive voice thinking and acting described in this commission, the dominant way people presented their personal evidence was, the department's view at the time was that this, and this comes back, and this is where we put things together right after a rambling conversation, I think, that people have to feel, they have to understand their role, they have to feel a sense of responsibility, and they've got to have an eye for their personal consequences. Yeah. So when I heard people saying things like, oh, look, I just cleared those words that I received.
Yes.
I was hearing the voice of a busy public servant, no doubt, right? And it would be terrifying for middle managers who have huge responsibilities watching the commission. They'll be like, oh my God, every time I receive words, I've got to test them now. Yeah. When am I going to sleep? There's moments when I have to
never open my emails so I can prove I never read it, right? Like it's the alternative,
well, that's it.
Right?
Well, that's the regulatory stimulus that we start, because there's no guarantee that watching the commission was a positive regulatory stimulus. No guarantee whatsoever. We're going to get to that, I think, in terms of record keeping.
Just to say, Sam Bankman-Fried in his trial on Friday said he aimed to keep his inbox to 60,000 unread emails. And I just thought it was a brilliant example of someone trying to obfuscate their responsibility. But that's how he said, I just never read my emails, so how could I have known?
And see, that's where Kundera's point about knowledge being a second-rate question is key.
What should you have known?
Because it's about what should you have known, and also how do we bring structures where the knowledge comes to you. It isn't something you can duck. It isn't something you can defer. How do we trap people in moments which protect them? Because I think many people will have, some of the people listening will have known the people giving evidence.
Yes.
And I think the key thing very much is how brittle our systems have to be for this to be the picture day after day. And I do think as well that some of it was rational. We need to confront that as well.
Yes.
That this was a rational cost-benefit analysis of what the institution, what the institution valued.
Yeah.
And this comes back to, when I talked about doing a good enough job.
Yeah.
Some people have said, well, I'm one of the good ones. You have to do a bit of give and take to keep in the position.
Yeah.
Do you know the people who are going to come in here after me?
Yeah.
What they might look like?
Yeah.
That's the headspace some people get into. And they begin to barter towards doing, well, I put a brief up that was slightly better than that, what would have gone from the lower down person. I put some stuff into it.
But I maintain
and we
influence, I maintain context. Yeah.
Because we're all involved in trade-offs, and the sort of tactical careerism was huge in the commission.
Now that is a beautiful segue then, because I'm conscious of time and I do want to get us to this cabinet confidentiality, transparency of information, because I love it. Like, it's like I hear your intellectual arguments about it, but as a public servant, I feel deeply uncomfortable about the idea that I might provide advice to cabinet and that might be shared widely. So talk to me, convince me that I'm wrong.
So one of the things, like, this is going to be a fun.
We've been in wild agreement.
Right. So, and it comes back to the name of the podcast, the Westminster tradition. And one of the things that struck me about when the report released was there were some very sunny visions of the APS past being told.
We used to.
So things like, the famous warnings to Whitlam, to Fraser, Tony Byers, this sunny era when prime ministers would get very direct and robust language said to them. But one of the things about those moments when you analyse them and look at them is how many were written down.
Oh.
Analyse that. How many were written down?
Interesting.
Now, what I want to challenge the APS with is, I believe that the dynamics unleashed by not recording things in writing are dynamics that the APS has no answer for. That the stopper in the bottle of integrity is writing things down, and the idea that things will come out. I cannot see any way this report will succeed without recommendations 56 and 57 being implemented.
For the listeners, they are the recommendations that...
So, at the very end of the report, in concluding observations, Commissioner Holmes embraces some radical thinking, and she is a very unlikely candidate for radical thinking.
It's true.
I would go so far as I was staggered by page 656. And I regularly have taken to rereading it with a very, very broad smile on my face.
I love it.
Because, as a legal commentator, it's a Queensland Supreme Court judge. All the discipline and restraint that implies.
Yes.
And the very distinct, careful set of values that she will have carried in, many that I personally don't hold and sometimes challenge. For her to do what she does at the end of the report is, it's a microphone drop. The Holmes out. So what she calls for, what she says is really challenging for the APS. So she says, I have seen a big chunk of your cabinet in confidence material.
Yeah.
Now, we've said that previously. We have two very different secretaries. We have a generation of deputy secretaries almost across the 4 years.
Yeah.
And she's taken a sample, and what did she see? She tells us she saw not a single moment of frank and fearless advice. And
yeah.
Really, I mean, it's not me egging it on.
No.
She basically says,
I agree. That is what she says.
And her recommendation is that to change that dynamic, you need to vary the rules on cabinet in confidence to allow a public interest balance apply to those documents.
Yeah.
So that when there is, and that's key.
Yeah.
Because I know there will be fear out there, and there may be some incentive, in fact, for people who are opposing this, which will be a very strong group, to sort of say, well, this is hoodlum stuff. Yeah. But bear in mind that all the absolute exemptions under the FOI Act would still apply. So anything security-based, all of that stuff is lock stock, like absolute, right? International relations, DFAT get to retire all their material, they're fine. But what she's basically saying is, when we have these types of risk warnings in briefs, our democracy will not function unless we can know what the minister knows. And I think the Royal Commission experience speaks very powerfully to that.
Yeah.
Because we've spoken an awful lot about public servants, because that's the nature of the podcast. But one of my real frustrations with every public servant in this thing was that all we wanted to do was get at those politicians.
Yeah.
That's all we were asking for, was tag them with some facts and some knowledge and tell them about the risks. And that's when democracy can click into action.
Yeah.
Because if it's deniable, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Because that's just if it's just, I was about to say, don't do it if it's going to be more oral. Because it might as well not happen. It might as well not happen. Not because, what are you letting loose? What governance dynamics are you letting loose if these facts don't go into the hands of the ministers? The facts about the risk, the facts about what's happening to people.
Yeah.
We can't get the ethical conversation. We can't get them saying, you were told.
Yeah. And
that is fundamentally what we ended up with in the Royal Commission, even after, at the end of it all, was noble-minded declarations of on-paper responsibility. You know, politicians rolling in and saying, well, if only I had known, I would have acted. Of course I'm responsible in that abstract sense.
Yeah. I take full responsibility for everything except I
cop to the Westminster accountability, you know?
Yeah.
Which is an empty responsibility, because it's got to be a functional responsibility, and the only thing that will make it functional and the lifeblood of our democracy is the facts and the risks in the hands of the politicians. And there is an obligation on every public servant who has their hand on a risk, on an inconvenient fact, to politicise that responsibility. And many public servants will say, it's terrible we're in the media. How did we end up in the media and being attacked? Do people not understand our role? Well, my response to that would be, if you make sure the minister has what's on your desk, people won't come at the level that people in Robodebt experienced. You know? And it's incredible for me as well that Holmes has been, I think 56 then, so recommendation 57 says no safe spaces.
Yeah.
where you can put the PricewaterhouseCoopers report, right? Which is the irony. I mean, everyone is going on about this $1 million report and staging a performance about it when everyone in government will know that was going into cabinet anyway. We were never seeing it. And as long as that safe space exists, because even if stuff is sent into cabinet, it might as well not exist for the purposes of our politics because it will never be seen. The executive minute was the subject of 7 failed orders of production in the Senate.
Yeah.
I couldn't get the executive minute when we went looking for it on the Freedom of Information laws.
It's incredible.
And like, there's no more visible example of how the cabinet confidentiality does real harm to people. And again, I'm not being a hoodlum when I say that. It's public interest balance. Look at the document. Is there a key warning about a massive issue for hundreds of thousands of Australians, and bend a little bit and say, if that's safe, if that's invisible, people will suffer, you know?
I think that is a brilliant place to end us. That was so delightful, and I suspect we will have to do a round 2 because there were so many things we didn't get to.
Oh, there's loads. So like, I mean...
But just thank you from the bottom of my heart, because I know you've got a lot going on.
No, but I enjoy that. Like, but again, it's like... didn't get to half of it.
No,
really.
But that's all right. We'll keep going. We'll keep going. You can be a regular.
Yeah, I'm more than happy. I mean, if you wanted... But if you wanted to have a crack again, you know, let me know.
That was fabulous. Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. If you want rigorous reporting on Robodebt, we recommend the work of Rick Morton at the Saturday paper, Chris Nouse and Luke Henrique Gomez at the Guardian, Ben Eltham at Crikey, and of course, the Robodebt Royal Commission itself. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.